Welcome to Entanglement Radio, transcendent talk for the conscious mind. Join us for inspiring conversations with visionaries in spiritual science, new thought, and conscious healing. Explore the potential and infinite possibilities of what it means to be human with some of the best guests in radio. At Entanglement Radio, it is all connected. Now, here is your host, Angela Levesque, on the OMTimes Radio Network.
To Entanglement Radio with Angela Levesque right here on OMTimes Radio Network. I'm coming to you live today from the beautiful foothills of the Rocky Mountains here in Boise, Idaho. I have a huge guest for you. We have Dr. Stephen Hairfield, and he is the American monk, and we are talking about his book, A Metaphysical Interpretation of the Bible. So I'm really excited. I think this is a great follow-up to last week's show that we had with Simran Singh, as we talked about how stories affect our ability to love ourselves. And today we're going to talk about, are there other ways to look at stories such as the creation story, Noah's Ark, the book of Revelations? And we're going to see, did we miss the point in some of our conversations and some of our interpretations of those stories and those books. So I'm quite excited to dive into that conversation. Next week, we have author William T. Hathaway, and he's actually a fiction writer, and occasionally I like to have authors of fiction on here, mostly because I also enjoy reading fiction. But he's written several books about not too far off dystopian versions of our future. The last time I interviewed him, he wrote a book called Wellspring, A Fable of Consciousness, that talked all about droughts in California and them running out of water. And lo and behold, right? I just read an article a few weeks ago about how California has 1 year of water left. So this next work that he's going to be talking about next week is called Lila the Revolutionary. We're going to be discussing evolution or revolution and kind of look at the spiritual implications of both. I just want to mention, if you need to get a hold of me at any time during the week, you can email me at angela@hestiahealth.com. I will be on Sarah Nash's show tomorrow, Radio Namaste, at 3 p.m. Eastern, so you can hear that. And I also am going to be offering a free Kindle version of my book on May 11th through 13th. So if you're listening to a rebroadcast of this show, and it is May 11th through 13th, you can go to Amazon and you can find my book there, Healing Environment, The Conscious Creation of Health. So with that, I'm quite excited. I'm going to introduce my guest here today. Having been raised in a very abusive environment, Stephen decided to serve his country in the military. His duties and expertise led him to Vietnam. On a search for peace and higher understanding, he was led to a Zen Buddhist Monastery in South Vietnam. There he became a Zen Priest through his experience. When Stephen returned home after working with his Eastern teachers, he wanted to understand the belief system and studied the greatest belief system of all, religion and theology, and becoming quite interested by the field of metaphysics in the process. Through his years of study with Zen and Tibetan monks, as well as Cree and Blackfoot native traditions, this true American monk offered an unparalleled approach to understanding how we directly influence our own experiences. In his book entitled A Metaphysical Interpretation of the Bible, he talks of the truth of Christ and his very real message that he wanted us to realize. He also has a new release about to come out entitled Know What Tomorrow Brings, Karma, the 12 Principles. So with that, I feel very honored and blessed to welcome Dr. Stephen Hairfield to the program. How you doing?
I'm doing wonderful, and thanks for having me on here. Great introduction, by the way. When I hear it, it's kind of like, who?
It's all you.
Yeah, but when you look back in retrospect, you have to go, wow. At least I do, because from a rocky beginning to everything I've encountered and turning around and just absolutely adoring the human race and society. I think it's a great place that we have.
I agree, and I'm quite excited that you started the conversation that way, because I think that sometimes when we talk about things that are contrary to popular belief, like some of the things that we might challenge today as we discuss the Bible, that sometimes we can fall into a place of cynicism or skepticism. So I'm glad that you framed this conversation with just how much you love and adore humanity and this earth. So I think that's great.
Well, it is. I just think all of us are just so conditioned, and we operate so much on automatic pilot that we don't go in search of things for our own selves. I remember when I was in India, one of my teachers asked me how in the world I could find what I already have. And I think that's probably the essence of many of the messages that Christ himself shared. How do you find what you already have? You see, we're always looking outside of ourselves and reflecting on our past and repeating our pasts and historical behavior, even if we look at global society, that we're all doing the exact same things. And I think what we've done is we've missed all of the original messages that were left for us to understand. And there's one thing out of many that I know for sure. Christ didn't do what he did so that a religion could be made out of him. I've actually had people ask me if Christ was a Christian, and I just have to chuckle because no, he was delivering very distinct messages of how we as human could achieve our own natural divine state, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It's interesting. So I grew up, a little bit of my background, I grew up in a very Christian household where the Bible was black and white. It was absolutely taken very literally in every way. And, you know, one of my biggest things is growing up is as I would have conversations with my parents, and I said, you know, there was so many things, but the thing that was really like the point, I was like, how could God want to send billions of people to hell? And that was the thing. I was like, I don't understand that. And they're like, well, this is it. This is what it says in the Bible, and that's it. And I said, well, I can't get on board with that God. That doesn't connect with me in any part of my being. There's not a single cell that would think that a God, you know, this idea of this vindictive God, and, you know, needing people to, it's his way or the highway, or else they're sent to hell. And I was like, I can't do that. And they're like, well, then I guess, you know, you're going to probably be joining them. And I thought, wow, that is harsh.
It is.
That is really harsh.
It reminds me of something that Christ himself said, and I believe 100% in what the Bible says. I think it's an absolutely astounding book, but I think it's just being misused as a weapon. Christ himself made this statement, that a house divided cannot stand against itself. And when we look at what religion has done, it's doing nothing but teaching division. There's a God and a devil. There's a heaven and a hell. That's all divisive and creates division. So automatically, the church is built in to where that if you wanted to be saved from not going to hell, the only place you could go would be to go to church. And of course, through the centuries, people have believed that. But we have to understand just a brief thing. How did the churches, early churches is the one I'm talking about, because the churches today are just repeating what they've been doing for centuries. But if you really think back, the early kingdoms needed someone to gather taxes, so the churches volunteered that they would do it. Now here you have a church not only collecting taxes for the kingdom and, of course, getting paid, but you also had the threat of losing your land, losing your life, and going to hell all at the same time. And that's how they gained their authority. And I remember a speech that Pope John Paul gave in 1996. He asked that humanity forgive the idea of the Inquisitions because over 10 million people gave up their lives through torture and death, so that the church could gain the level of authority that it had beyond question, which is what they wanted. And then everybody just followed after that. And then if you really think about it, a house divided, no. I mean, it's kind of like the way churches do it. Here's God, here's the devil. They're playing a game, and the human is the ball. No. And by the way, I'm a recovering Catholic, is what I love to share with people. So been there, done that. So the whole idea of what Christ said, I would rather believe what Christ said. And also in the book of Genesis, God supposedly said, now you are just like me. Wow. Christ said we were like him. God said we were like it. So you're correct. There's no such thing as a punishing God. It really isn't. It just wants us to be just like it. And here's the funny thing. We are. If God says we are, and Jesus says we are, and the churches say we're not, excuse me a second. I would rather believe the idea of God in Jesus than I ever would a church, so to speak. I hope that's not too harsh.
Well, I think that that's a really important distinction, is that when you look at the messages, especially the messages of Jesus, it's not the same thing as what the church, I think that that's an important distinction, is that so you can look at those messages and kind of remove all of the dogma that the church then came in and said, here, look, we have proof. This is what we're saying, and this is the reason why we want you to do stuff. And I think it's good to separate those two, because they're not one and the same.
No, they're absolutely not one and the same, and they were never intended to be. I mean, even if you look at, there's a lot of numbers that appear. There's a lot of biblical stories that are told that we just totally misunderstand. I mean, you gave one up front, Noah's flood. What was that? When we look at ancient linguistics, the words just didn't mean the same as what we mean them as today. And here's a perfect example of one. Virgin Mary. We interpret the word virgin in the way that we see it today, as a very chaste person. But in ancient Aramaic terminology, that's not what it meant. The word virgin just simply meant young person. That's all it meant. Nothing more than that. So Virgin Mary was a young person, and that we know historically, because the Bible even says that she was a young person. Okay, so you have that metaphor right there that has been totally misunderstood. And by the way, the churches today acknowledge that that's the truth.
Well, when we get back, I want to talk a little bit more about what's wrong with taking our present day mindset and applying it to ancient texts, and talk a little bit more about how things maybe have been misinterpreted along the way. So we are talking with Dr. Stephen Hairfield here today on Entanglement Radio with Angela Levesque.
Best of the holistic, spiritual, and conscious world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
Welcome to The Gathering Around My Kitchen Table on Equilarium FM, Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Join my guests as we integrate spirituality into everyday reality with vibrant conversations, inspired interviews, and my latest channeled guidance to inspire and brighten your day. I'm Claire Johnson, and together we'll be raising vibrations across the nations.
Host your show on IOM FM, the radio network of OMTimes Media, one of the more recognized brand names in the conscious community, and is backed by the extensive marketing reach of OMTimes. Hosting a show on IOM FM immediately connects you with our extensive dedicated community. The number one reason girls drop out of school in sub-Saharan Africa is lack of access to feminine hygiene products. The Pads for Schoolgirls Project, an outreach of Humanity Healing International, is changing this paradigm by setting up sewing programs at schools, teaching girls a vocational skill, while producing the reusable pads that help keep them attending classes. The girls pay it forward by making and giving pad kits to other girls in need. To learn more, visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
What if living didn't have to be so serious?
What if you could move beyond your problems with greater confidence and ease than you've ever imagined?
Throw your labels out the window and join the Irreverent Therapist for practical tips and a very different way of approaching the changes you would like to create.
Marilyn Bradford
and Pam Hodling
have empowered hundreds of people to come out of self-judgment, quit looking to experts, and begin to create the lives they desire.
Join us Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on the Irreverent Therapist Show.
Bringing you the best of the conscious minds in the world. OMTimes Radio, your conscious lifestyle on steroids.
All right, we are back, and you're listening to Entanglement Radio with Angela Levesque. My guest again today is Stephen Hairfield, and we are talking about the subject of his book, A Metaphysical Interpretation of the Bible. So before the break, you were saying that, even some of the words like the word virgin back when that was written has a different meaning than it does now. And one of the things that I thought was interesting too is that I learned that the word Satan actually meant adversary in Hebrew, which is a completely different, I think it evokes a completely different feeling than, this person that's down in hell with the horns and the fire and all of that, which I appreciate came more out of the culture than it did out of the writing. But is there a few other examples that you can give us of ways that things have been misinterpreted?
Oh, absolutely. There's a passage and even changed. Angela, one of my hobbies is collecting Bibles, and my oldest one is 1805. Wow. And the wording it has and the wording that modern Bibles have is totally different. When I wrote that book, I used modern Bibles. I used the 1805 and an 1837 and an 1877 and a 2004. And it's amazing at that number when you're sitting there with all of those Bibles open and going verse by verse, and you got to shake your head. But as an example, in the book of Revelation, there's a statement that says, "Do not harm those that have the seal of God on their forehead." And that's from the modern Bibles. The older ones say, "in their forehead." There's a world of difference between those two concepts. One is externalized, the other is internalized, meaning the third eye or the sixth chakra, those with the intuitive sense, were the ones that weren't going to be harmed. And even if you look at the ancient word water, it did not necessarily mean water. It meant spirit. So when Jesus was baptized in the River Jordan, the water, he was baptized in spirit. And the interesting thing, by the way, about that was a lot of people don't realize that John was actually Jesus's cousin. But when they met at the River Jordan, they acted like they didn't know each other. Well, excuse me a second. How could cousins not know each other? They could. So when you look at Noah's flood, seeming to move around a little bit here, it wasn't about the world being inundated with water. It was the world going through a shift in higher divine consciousness, being inundated by that spirit, that is. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So the flood actually never happened.
Huh. And my conditioning as I hear you say that, I think people are going to be ticked off hearing you say that because how do you do you find that most people are welcoming of, because to me that's so much gentler. That makes so much more sense to hear the way that you describe the flood versus, God wanted to wipe everything out. It's a a different feeling.
No, it's a totally different idea. But the interesting thing is I get my flack over it, and people tell me that I don't believe. But my response is, and always has been, I would rather believe in the idea of the Creator and get there and find out that it's an illusion than to not believe in the idea of the Creator and get there and go, uh-oh. I've got a little bit of difficulty now. But it's in the way. You see, I don't believe that God created us to worship it. That would be pure ego that would do something like that. I believe it created us, just like Genesis said, to create its own self in physical dynamics, the human. And we don't see that. I mean, people say we're not perfect, and I love to look at them and go, wait a minute, are you saying God makes mistakes? and that thing is supposed to be the epitome of perfection? So if it didn't create us perfectly, then it would make that whole idea a joke. And I don't think people look at it that way when they could. Even the idea of Satan, and by the way, you are correct in the Hebraic interpretation of that word, but in the Vedas, the word Satan is described as ego. So there's not that much of a difference between those two ideas. Adversarial, doesn't the ego seem to be adversarial? Yes, but not really if you understand it. I mean, Angela, when I went to India and I found out Christ actually spent 18 years in India studying the Vedas, I was floored, but my admiration for him went through the roof. Because you see, you cannot become like that if you worship that, because if you worship that, you're making it something you cannot be. That's why he said, do not worship idols, which is what we've done with him, turned him into an idol, which means human can be that, and we can operate in that if we would allow ourselves to grow into it through recognition that it is indeed there and that we are just like God. It says that right in the book of Genesis.
Why do you think we have such a desire then? And maybe this was created by the church and this goes to programming, but people, especially when I talk to, people in my family, they say, that idea that God is within us seems, they just don't want to accept that. They why do we want to keep him separate?
Well, there is actually only one sin, and that one sin is the idea of separation. That's the only sin. And as long as we stay separated, we cannot be that because we're separated from it. When Christ was asked in the book of Luke where the kingdom of heaven was, his response was very succinct. He said, you look here and you look there for the kingdom of heaven, yet you do not look within you. Well, if God's in heaven and heaven is within us, what does that make us? Where does that put God? Within us. Mm-hmm. We are that temple. We are that sacred ground which no one sees or no one wants to accept. And it's that lack of acceptance of what we're told that we are. In fact, religion tells us everything that we are not. And the reason for that is simple, because they become wealthy. I'm just going to go ahead and say this. Did you know the Catholic Church is the owner of American Express?
No, I did not.
Yes, that's who owns and controls American Express, amongst many, many other things. And I'm not throwing that out there to slam dunk the churches whatsoever. Kudos, because they're able to do it. But let's give the truth of the message. Let's give the truth of who we are and what we're actually about. Even the idea of Lucifer, the word luce actually means light. And the whole word Lucifer is bright, shining morning star. Okay, so if it's bright, shining morning star, why is he evil? It's not. It's the anchor. It's the two forces of positive and negative energies that have come together to create manifest life. And yes, Lucifer is the prince of darkness because God requested that it go sit in eternity in darkness to be the anchor for all of physical life. And then they threw their energies at each other, Big Bang, and life was created. So they're working in unison with each other, not in opposition of each other. And here we are being taught that they are in opposition, which creates opposition within us. And that's just not the truth. The truth is we are what God created.
So I'm just curious what you think, that if this is, if more churches spoke this truth and they talked about the God within us, do you think that would we see like the dissolving of churches, or do you think that would actually strengthen? Do you think you would see more people coming to church to really connect with that truth?
Ultimately, I think it would dissolve it. I really do. And I think that's what they don't want. I mean, the last thing in reality is that any churches are going to want to have happen is for us to come to the full realization of our own divine nature as the truth. Because you see, what would happen if they were to teach that truth, people would become sacred in the way that they lived. Sacred. And that's what's not in this reality today. We don't see that. We don't identify ourselves with it because we're conditioned to believe that you can't do that, that Christ was the only begotten Son. Well, excuse me, but God didn't say that. Human did, and human does, and it's just simply not the truth. We were created in the image and likeness. It says that. Okay, image and likeness. What is that? That means that. So you see, the messages have just been turned and used. Now, ultimately, if the churches were to teach the truth, it could help them in the long run. But ultimately, once everybody understood it, lived it, there would be no need for that external source, because all the indicators of the Bible is it's all internal, and it's our choice. I mean, if we knew the level of ability that we have, I mean, as an example, Angela, you like I, we've created every single experience that we have in our lives. We have. But nobody wants to own that. Nobody. We were made as co-creators as long as we are unified with that idea. That's the level of power and authority that we have. In fact, in the book of Genesis, you would also read this statement, that we have dominion over all things. It doesn't say we're better than, but we have dominion over it. Now, we cannot have dominion over anything as long as those things control and own us. No, they have the authority. We don't, meaning the external world, the outer world. That's not what was ever meant to be. That's the reason we have so many dilemmas in our reality today, because the outer world has that authority when it's backward. Even in the book of Isaiah, he said that we live our lives backward. And we do.
Yes, that's, it's interesting about the dominion thing, because I think that many people have taken that and we've used that as a way to kind of dominate our environment and our earth and abuse the animals in the ways that we have. But we are up on our break. When we get back, I want to talk about the creative principle, which you mentioned many times. We're speaking with Stephen Hairfield here, and you're listening to Entanglement Radio with Angela Levesque. We'll be right back after this break.
The future of Internet radio is here. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
Do you have time to read that inspiring book or that blog post you've been meaning to get to? In your busy world, how do you improve yourself and keep your life going? I'm Lisa Kay, and my Between Heaven and Earth radio show can transform your life just by listening. Be uplifted with inspiring topics, positive stories, and ideas that really work. Between Heaven and Earth Radio is conscious living for your soul, every Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time.
Being a radio host on IOM FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the Internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network. Are you trying to get from point A to point B and need a little advice? Connect with the counselors at OMTimes Advisors. Whether you're looking for a life coach or a spiritual intuitive, the advisors participating at advisors.omtimes.com were carefully chosen based on their gifts, skills, and professionalism. OMTimes Advisors, connecting you with the best advisors in the business.
Hello, I'm Miriam Knight of New Consciousness Review, inviting you to my new show where I interview the rising stars of the conscious awakening. We'll explore the many faces of consciousness in action and intriguing perspectives on life, the universe, and everything in between. Join us each Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern on the Rising Stars Show.
Conscious media for conscious minds. OMTimes.
All right, we are back, and you're listening to Entanglement Radio with Angela Levesque right here on IOM.FM. My guest today is Stephen Hairfield, and we're talking about the subject of his book, A Metaphysical Interpretation of the Bible. So in your book, you mention the word or the phrase creative principle, capital C, capital P. What are you referring to when you use that?
Well, to me, the ancient spelling of the Creator's name is YHWH. Are you familiar with that acronym?
Yes.
All right. We turned that into Yahweh or Yebehe, Yahweh, Jehovah, to God. What if it's not a name at all? What if it's a mathematical equation, a sacred geometrical equation for the creation of life? If you take a look at it, Y is the soul firstborn and is a negative charge. If you look at the first H, that's mind, thought, or atom, or Atman. That's a positive charge. W is Eve, feel, or emotion. That's a negative charge. And the last H is the last born, which is known as the body. And that's a positive charge. So it is a mathematical formula for the creation of life through positive and negative forces or energies. Nighttime is a negative charge. Daytime is the positive charge. And even when you look at the idea of masculine and feminine, masculine is a positive charge, feminine is a negative charge. And a lot of people go, wait, women aren't bad. I'm not saying that. It's just a mathematical equation of the energies that created life, and also in that. And if you notice, I did say Adam and I did say Eve as the H and the W. All right, you also have in that, you have the Holy Trinity according to Christianity. What? Certainly you do. You have the Holy Ghost, Y, soul. You have the Father, which is the H and the W, Adam and Eve. The Father is the guiding source of the Son, body. So now you have the Holy Trinity sitting there staring you in the face just from those four initials. So it was never meant to be a name. It was never meant to even be a word. It was the divine idea that gave us life. And they were charges, just like the poles of a battery. You have a positive pole and a negative pole. If you were to disconnect either one of those poles off the battery, you would never be able to start your car, and life would have never been able to have been generated because it wouldn't have had any charges to give to it. And you can find that principle absolutely everywhere. As an example, your logical left brain is a positive charge. Your right brain's a negative charge. Your whole brain is a positive charge. Your heart is a negative charge. Heck, your soul is a negative charge, and your body is a positive charge. So it is everywhere, and it is involved in absolutely everything in life. It is life. That little formula.
The creative principle. I like it.
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
So you have studied not only the Bible, you have studied many other ancient texts. And are there just incredible similarities between all of the texts that you've looked at?
They are all pretty much identical and say the exact same things. From the Vedas through the Buddhist sutras, I've had the opportunity to study the Nag Hammadi, the Dead Sea Scrolls. In fact, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it actually says that a single human thought is greater than the mightiest of earthquakes or lightning that cleaves an oak tree. It actually says that. That's the power that we wield between our ears. And when we understand what all of those texts tell us, whether it's the Vedas, the Sutras of Patanjali, or the Buddhist Sutras, the Vedas, or the biblical text, they all say exactly the same message. The difference is simple. The biblical text was turned into a religion, and the rest are philosophies of living. That's all they are, and that's all the Bible is. And that's really what it says to us.
One thing that I notice, from reading some of the things that are non-biblical is that there's so much more history in the Bible. And I think that sometimes makes it a little bit more difficult to pull out the messages because it is so wrapped up in the history. And especially if you don't know much about history, I don't think that you necessarily understand the words written in the historical context. Would you agree with that?
Oh, totally. You have to remember the journey of the Bible is amazing in itself. I mean, to go from ancient Aramaic to 2nd century Greek, which, by the way, the word Lord, L-O-R-D, is a 2nd century Greek word for I am that I am. That's all Lord means. And then it went from Greek to Latin. 2 people lost their lives attempting to translate it into English. In the Bible we have today, the King James, the only reason they didn't burn him at the stake is because he was the king of Scotland. But the church disowned Scotland over that. So the Catholic Church doesn't really exist in Scotland because somebody translated it into the Queen's English. And people actually think that Christ spoke that way. No, he was Aramaic. He didn't use thee and thine. No. And in those translations, a lot of the messages were shifted and changed. And they made, and interestingly enough, you say history, okay. Is that history to a point? Yes. But it's metaphorical history. Like Noah's flood. Okay, you heard me, it didn't happen. People say, but there's seashells in the mountains. Yeah, and those mountains used to be under the ocean, and that's well known. But people like to think that there was. It wasn't. In fact, if anybody can find it, there's a book out there. It's called the Book of Jasher, Jasher. And his name is mentioned twice in the Bible, but they don't say anything that he said. If you can get the Gospel of Jasher, you'll find out. Because Noah's son, according to Jasher, asked his dad if he could move from the plain of Shinar because of overpopulation. Excuse me? I thought all of life got wiped out in this flood. No, it didn't, because it wasn't the way we were taught it to be. So in all of those translations and all of those historical things, some of them were just metaphorical in their explanations and not hard fact. It's as simple as that. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And one thing that I only learned about maybe, 5 or 6 years ago is that there was a whole bunch of books like Jasher that didn't make the cut, that didn't make the canonized version of, and that to me was amazing. So having looked at some of that stuff, what were some of the things that really kind of pop out to you that we're missing that would really help us fill out this story?
Well, in the Nag Hammadi, you have the Gospel of Thomas that says this, that when you make the 2 into 1, you can say mountain, move from here to there, and it will be given you. It also says in the Gospel of Thomas that if you do not bring forth what is within you will destroy you. But if you bring forth what is within you, it will save you. Interestingly enough, the Bible also gives those same indications. So what's those 2 things? Well, it's getting rid of the illusion of separation, that you and God operate together, not separate. You bring your soul forth, and then anything will be given to you. And if you look at the Bible, we have dominion over all things. Gospel of Thomas says the same thing. Everybody says Christ always spoke in parables, but when you look in the Gospel of James in the Nag Hammadi, he would say, and he does say, there are only 7 parables. Now, isn't that interesting? Only 7, and that happens to be true. Counted them. Even in the Sermon on the Mount, there were 7 points. When you go into Revelation, there were 7 letters to the 7 churches. What is all of that? That's all about the 7 chakras in each message he gave, because he learned about the chakra system in the Far East. How do we know that? Where do you think the phrase, what you sow, so shall you reap, actually came from? That's the first principle of karma in Buddhism. What you sow, so shall you reap. Now, so that says right there, Christ was taught that And he was taught it while he was in India, and he understood totally the idea of karma, and he was using it to do what he was doing. And we can as well. So you see that number 7 is about awakening all of that chakra system so that you can step into your true nature and be who you truly are, not what. And in fact, even if you look at the idea of revelation, that's just a word that says revealed. It's not about death and destruction and the end of the world. That's not what that means at all. In fact, revelation is a perfect example that if as one opens each of those 7 chakras, what they are going to experience within themselves and as to what they will become at the end. So that whole message has been totally misconstrued. Does that make sense? It's about awakening to the truth of you.
Absolutely. That's what I was going to ask you a little bit more, get into that after the break, the book of Revelations, because there is so much mystery and ideas and, end of the world kind of stuff is happening. So I want to get to that. We just have just about a minute or so before we go to the break. Another thing that I want to ask you when we come back is the removal of the sacred feminine, because that to me was interesting too. So, because
that's huge.
It is huge. And it's interesting too that it is, we're seeing it's coming back so much more into our consciousness. I see the goddess and the feminine and all of that. I actually had Dr. Karen Tate. I don't know if you're familiar with her. I had her on the program about a month ago, and we talked all about the sacred feminine liberation theology and all of this really interesting stuff. And so as I'm reading your book and I'm realizing just how much it was intentionally left out, it makes me a little bit, it makes me, 1, a little bit angry, and 2, quite sad.
Well, first of all, don't be angry. Back in those days when they put this together, just real quickly, it was a male idea. In fact, most of the people that the Catholic Church tortured and killed were, by the way, out of those 10 million, mostly were women, by the way. And that's a known fact. Ancient prophecy tells us. And I'll continue that when we get back.
Yes, absolutely. If you're just joining us, we're talking to Stephen Hairfield, and we are talking about his book, A Metaphysical Interpretation of the Bible. When we get back, we're going to talk about the sacred feminine and the book of Revelations. You're listening to Entanglement Radio with Angela Levesque. We'll be back in just a moment.
Feed your soul with waves of consciousness on OMTimes Radio.
If you remember living fearlessly, joyfully, and in a world filled with adventure, happiness, pleasure, and unbridled living, then this show is for you. Join me, Dame Nicole Brandon, as I bring you the world's top experts in wealth, creativity, flow, seat-edging technology, space, wellness, health, love, lust, and passion, all merging together each week here at the Hub of Happiness. Mondays at 6 p.m. Pacific Time and 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Passionate Living, where you can ride on the magic carpet ride of living and learn how to lead a passionately wild, exciting, and outrageously amusing life.
Being a radio host on IOM-FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network. Have you ever wondered how to change your love paradigm? The secret key is finding a love partnership, not just a regular connection. How do you find these? Through conscious relationships. Ascending Hearts Dating is a dating site for people like you that believes in second chances and a different type of spiritual connection. Try Ascending Hearts for free today at ascendinghearts.com and change your love paradigm. Ascending Hearts, the premier dating community for the spiritually awake.
Imagine receiving healing, vibration-raising energy as you listen to the radio, energy that flows effortlessly to you. Imagine exploring all things metaphysical, sharing in an ongoing adventure. Join me, Karen Smoot, along with my co-hosts Lisa Victorson and Wendy Weber for Immersion into Source every Wednesday, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here on Om Radio.
The Real Conscious Connection. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM.
We are back here in the last segment of Entanglement Radio with Angela Levesque. My guest again today is Stephen Hairfield, and we are talking about the subject of his book, A Metaphysical Interpretation of the Bible. Well, before the break, I was saying that I was a little disturbed about the intentional omission of the sacred feminine in the Bible, and even that, I was telling Simran last week that growing up, I was told that menstruation is painful, that all of this stuff is because Eve, basically she screwed up in the Garden of Eden. And so there's just certain things we have to expect, and it's a consequence of her actions. And I can't get on board with that either. But then I'm reading your book, and even more of that, and the story of Mary Magdalene, right? Thinking that she's a prostitute, and you have a different interpretation of that. Let's hear.
I totally do. First off, I had to chuckle. The story about Eve, and I think you said she screwed up. No, she didn't. Think about something. The Bible had to find a starting place. According to the Bible, the earth is only 5,000 years old. Give me a break. So they had to have a start point, then they had to have an end point. Start point was Genesis, end point was Revelation. But if you really look at that story in Genesis, you mean to tell me God created this, and then he decided that, okay, I'm going to use old Satan here, my buddy, and I'm going to have him tempt Eve because she's kind of a bonehead and a weak person, and I know she's going to go for it, and Adam is too brilliant, he won't touch it. So in enters the serpent. Well, isn't Kundalini referred to as the serpent?
Yes.
All right. What she did was she stepped into her divine nature and she said, Adam, look what we can be. And then supposedly God said, oh, man, you blew it. Now you're just totally like me, and I can't have you here in Genesis anymore. So here's your eviction notice, so you turkeys have to go. No, that was done absolutely intentionally. You could say Eve was the first divine achievement in physical form because she used her knowledge of self and her blessed feminine ability to create the ideal of what God had chosen for each of us to be. Now, that's a little bit of a different take. Now,
I like that one way better.
All right, but it is just simply the truth. Getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden, no, we were never kicked out of it. We're still in it. We've just changed it to something it was never intended to be because male dominance took over, creating even a greater level of ego than was ever intended to be. And ego is a self-fulfilling prophecy of its own self. Now, ego is not a bad thing. I think ego just simply had to be trained. My teachers taught me how to train my ego so it works for me. Now, you talk about the return of the divine feminine. What they did in ancient times is they actually, during the Dark Ages, they usurped one superstition and gave it another one, is what they did. And they actually cut God in half when they took out the idea of the divine feminine. That's the reason when you look at the initials of YHWH, they include divine feminine. It's just as equal as divine masculine and YHWH. They are there. So Eve is necessary. Besides, I'd like to see a man give birth to a child. I think that'd be a hoot. So you can't tell me that God, in fact, I almost got kicked out of seminary because in the book of Genesis, here's what it says: let us create human in our image and in our likeness. And then it says, we did that. Okay, wait a second. According to psychology, that person's nuts because they're referring to themselves in a plural sense. And I asked, who's we in seminary? And they could not answer my question. They could not.
Mm.
And to this day, they never have, because they did not want to include the most half of the power of the idea of God, and that's the divine feminine. In fact, Angela, ancient prophecy, all of them say that we're going to go from a patriarchal society to a matriarchal society. There's the return of the divine feminine, and she's coming. And she's when you look at Mother Nature, when you look at the way humanity is behaving, it's because of the return of divine feminine is setting patriarchal mind on its ear, is what all of that is. So she's returning, and she's returning full tilt, and it's for the betterment of all of humankind. Patriarchal, I don't know if you were aware of this, but a negative thought and negative thinking is actually patriarchal. Loving, kind, gentle thoughts are actually matriarchal. So we're seeing divine feminine exerting herself in all of humanity. And by the way, Revelation also says she's coming.
Well, we only have a couple minutes left before we have to start wrapping it up. So
Sure.
Just to reiterate a little bit what you said, because there is so much prophecy and interpretation around the book of Revelation. And I don't know how many times we've heard that, this is the end times. How do you interpret that?
No, it's actually divine awakening. First off, when you look at Revelation, read the first sentence. It's not the revelation of St. John. No, it's the revelation of Jesus Christ as given to John. John was the secretary, and he wrote it. So John was not a prophet. He was a secretary. Nothing intended with that. Now, when you look at Revelation, just the word itself has nothing to do with end of the world. It has everything to do with being revealed, awakened. And the Revelation is the perfect roadmap of how to do it. It's perfect instructions with meditation included. It's there that'll help any and every human that follows it achieve that natural divine nature, which is what we were all intended to be, which Eve became the first example, and Mary Magdalene further. And by the way, that was Pope Gregory the Great that referred to her as a prostitute. And that was back in like 800 BC because she was too much competition. She was the founder of the Gnostics. All right, back to Revelation. And she knew this. By the way, Mary Magdalene is responsible for the book of John.
Oh, wow.
All right, so there's divine feminine right there that was snuffed.
Yes. Well, we only have a few minutes left, but one thing is fascinating to me, because you hear the number 7 everywhere, and
Yes.
your connection between the 7 parables and the chakra system is just, it's so cool. And you see 7, not only, obviously, it's used so many times in the Bible, but you see 7 everywhere.
Yes.
Is that just like a universal mystical number?
Yes, it is. It's actually also called the number of God.
Oh.
It's 7. All right. We have 7 chakras. There were 7 letters to the 7 churches, which was going to be specific communication that's going to be delivered energetically to the chakra system. Look at the world and behavior. And it also says that if you can open those 7 seals to the book of life, your DNA, then you will become that divine being. All right, you've got the 7 letters, 7 churches, 7 trumpets, the 7 angels. You have all of that, and it's just a roadmap. And people talk about the number of the beast, 666. No, that's not what it says. It says, let those with the ability to calculate the number of the beast is 666. Numerologically, that's a 9 or end of cycle. So we're looking at end of cycle and awakening of divine human because of the reinsertion of divine feminine, so to speak.
Once again, I love your interpretation much better than some others. We only have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to give you plenty of opportunity. Just for my listeners out there, we just barely scratched the surface of his book. It's quite large and so informative, and we could have talked for probably 2 days straight and not covered everything. So tell people where they can find your book and websites, anything else you'd like to leave my listeners with.
Absolutely. Of course, Amazon, but any bookstore on the planet can order it for you. It's been doing very well at Amazon. You can find out more about me by going to my website at, of course, www, and that's Hairfield, Hair, F as in Frank, IELD.com. Any questions? And yes, if you wish to email me and tell me how loopy I am, I appreciate those too. You can email me at stephen@hairfield.com. And of course, I'm on Facebook and Twitter, and I love communicating with people, basically.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much. It was very, very informative. And like I said, we just barely scratched the surface, but I hope we touched on some big points there. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, and I hope to be able to be back on with you again at some point.
Oh, that would be great. All right.
Maybe we can finish the idea of the book.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, coming up next week, we have William T. Hathaway, and he is a fiction writer, actually, but he often talks about dystopian versions of the future. And we're going to answer the question, revolution or evolution? And coming up next on OMTimes Radio Network, we have Equilibrium FM with Claire Johnson, and she's going to be talking about the power of three and how food and nutrition are key. And I just want to remind my listeners, if you are listening to one of the rebroadcasts, and it is May 11th through 13th, you can go to Amazon and download a free Kindle version of my book, Healing Environment, The Conscious Creation of Health, and you can sign up for my newsletter if you'd like to know more about the show at angela@hestiahealth.com. And find me on Facebook and on Twitter at Hestia Health and Entanglement Radio. This is Angela Levesque wishing you love and light. I will see you next week.